we've got some time left for some questions, which I have a few for the folks that hopefully will dig us into this subject just a little bit more. And the first one I want to throw out gets back to this idea of the changes in irrigation we've had. We've moved away from furrow and flood irrigation to much more efficient methods, which aren't recharging groundwater in the way they used to. So what does that mean moving forward as we look to balance the needs of the drought with groundwater management?
So I'll jump in and go first because I believe that what we need to do is just thinking about our total water budget and times of the year and a true conjunctive use model. And we've had great response of people thinking about times of the year to capture excess water, flood flows, whatever it might be, to recharge, specifically to do recharge. It flushes the soils, it captures water to help bring our groundwater basins into balance. We're in the process now of collecting good data because we don't want to create any unintended consequences of doing that. The UC has done a great job of the map that shows us the soils that are best for that. We've got great growers who stepped up immediately. They're partnering with the universities, with private companies, and with NGOs. This is really important. If we're going to start down this type of path, we have to make sure that all the stakeholders are a part of the process and feel that it's the right way of doing that. So I think being very intentional about recharge is an answer, and making sure, because we've seen as people have moved to very efficient on-farm water use practices, oftentimes that means they're doing groundwater pumping because their local irrigation district still delivers water once or twice a week, and here's the day. But we don't want to abandon that delivery system to be able to do this kind of recharge.
Yeah, I would add, too, that one of the really big challenges is the irrigation districts, and not in a negative way. And the irrigation districts that we have in the Central Valley primarily were developed in the 20s and 30s. They built these canals, they built these delivery systems to deliver water to my farm when the dams had water in their reserve at this certain time of the year. Recharge needs to occur at a time when late spring when the water's flowing off of the snow melts. So the challenge is, I've got nectarines, my neighbors have almonds that are blooming. Do we want water out in that field when we have these high flows? Some of us don't want water in those fields at that time because of fungus concerns and other things. But there's also systems that the districts that are looking at just charging up the canal systems themselves. There's thousands of miles of canals. Put a foot or 2 foot of water in that canal system throughout. That is a tremendous recharge. So it's good that the conversation's being brought up. It is a challenge, though, from an irrigation district's perspective to be able to practically handle this and do this correctly. But, you know, I applaud the efforts that have been started, at least to begin these conversations of utilizing this as a resource for recharge.
I'd just add, this is really the point of Sigma. You want to look at a basin and look at how to keep it in balance, and if there's going to be less recharge from flood irrigation, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but collectively the folks overlying that basin and the local agencies that are the designated Sigma agencies need to figure out how to recharge it and how to use the surface and groundwater that they have available conjunctively. I guess I would add that the trend toward water use efficiency is presumably not a short-term trend. It's a long one. It's driven by cost and nutrient management and a bunch of other things. So it's an adjustment that we'll have to make, and over-irrigating crops is not necessarily the best way to recharge anyway. You might have system losses, evapotranspiration. Now I'm getting into technical stuff. I'm a lawyer, right? So, but presumably you all back me up on this. In any case, you technical folks should help the districts figure out how to most cost-effectively keep these basins in balance.
Great. So that was the kind of easy warm-up question.
Yeah, we all jumped on that.
Now we'll move into some more political questions. and one is a real biggie. Sigma's fairly new, and it allows a 20-year timeline for implementation. However, if the current 5-year drought continues, perhaps even worsens, God forbid, will that process be enough, or are we going to potentially need to look at additional state intervention? And nobody's jumping on that one, are they?
Well, I will, but I'll let Kevin go first.
During the drought, we have heard some calls for SIGMA to be accelerated. I personally am not inclined toward that. I think that the timelines in SIGMA make a lot of sense. SIGMA was never designed to be a response to this drought. It's a long-term solution to a long-term problem. And I think that if you really look at what's going on in the basins right now and the local agencies trying to put together the governance, they're struggling. There's some of it's going well, some of it's not going well. They've only got less than a year left to meet that deadline. And then from there, they've got just 3 years in some cases or 5 years to draft plans, highly technical plans for which a lot of them are lacking a lot of data. So I don't think it's realistic, really, to just think that accelerating SIGMA is an answer. However, if there continues to be a drought, then the government is going to have to continue to respond to the drought, as we have been, with ways to mitigate it, food boxes to help communities, policy changes to help accelerate conjunctive use projects. We might have to tailor responses to things that are particularly bad or harmful in specific areas, like subsidence around the aqueduct has been a big concern lately. But that's the kind of thing that government does every day, is come up with solutions to current problems.
And there have been some calls in the legislature, particularly around land use and planting decisions, which have not gone very far. The most important thing that government can do from a policy point of view, and the governor has done this repeatedly through the use of executive orders, is one, making sure that disadvantaged communities who have gone, like they've gone from perhaps impacted quality of groundwater to no water for drinking, making sure that we have the mechanisms in place to make sure that our disadvantaged communities have drinking water. Secondly, there's so much more we can do on water use efficiency. Every one of us as Californians, that's the number one goal, although our water action plan has 10 different strategies. Goal number one is that we as Californians have an ethic of using every drop of water preciously. I've just come back from Israel. I can't tell you how for the first time in my life I really felt like water is life. They live their life around how they use water, and we have a lot more we can do in that. The use of recycled water, in particular for landscaping, understanding where it can be used for growing crops. There's so much more we can do, and in this last executive order, the governor has called for improved data being reported on water use efficiency from urban management agencies as well as agricultural water agencies. We know that there's more we can do with extending on-farm water use efficiency. Our SWEET program, which is the statewide water efficiency and enhancement program, which has been funded with cap and trade dollars, has the last call for $18 million of projects that's really improving water use efficiency on the farm. So we have to look at all of the tools, not one thing, and thinking that there's a silver bullet.
Yeah, I want to dig into this just a little bit more, because Gordon touched on the need to interact with the communities. So there has been some speculation that due to long-term groundwater overdraft combined with future droughts that are expected, and just the potential permanence of some of this due to climate change, that it's possible, there's a possible scenario where up to 10 to 20% of the irrigated land in the San Joaquin Valley may have to be retired, as much as 1 million acres. If something like that were to occur, what option is California exploring to help those communities make that very large transition in land use and economic and everything related to it?
Okay, guys, don't all jump at the microphone at the same time. Perry, do you have the answer? So, first of all, that is speculative. We know that agriculture is very adaptive and that there's already fallowing on a yearly basis in certain irrigation districts now, part of it because of subsidence issues. So they do fallowing on a rotational basis, so not the same landowner every year is, no one's permanently. However, in the Westlands district, they've permanently retired significant acres. They're exploring, we have a very bold goal for renewable energy, and they're exploring installation of wind or solar and really looking at being energy producers. And we have, through the drought executive order, we've been able to leverage some dollars through the emergency funds there with workforce development dollars from the feds to really identify there are farm jobs and food processing jobs that are not being filled now because we need new, ever-changing technical skills. Mm-hmm. It's not just coming into the workforce and this is what I can do, and it's creating, in some cases, better paying jobs, mm-hmm. and really focusing on that. We've got great programs through the community colleges in the Central Valley in particular that have really identified 5 or 6 categories of jobs that with some additional hours of training, people can get a certificate in irrigation management, the new watering systems. You have to make sure it's not just the landowners that are involved here, it's making sure the employees have the skills to make sure those systems are operating as efficiently as possible. We have new food quality laws that are coming into place, and that's going to require a lot of new skills training. So there are those kinds of mechanisms that we're doing, but there's no grand plan that I'm aware of.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I guess I would be cautious about laying out a scenario like that in the long term. There just seem to be so many variables. Who can predict exactly what's going to happen with the Delta, for example? That's going to be a big deal. I think, I don't know how many people would have predicted 20 or 30 years ago the changes we're seeing in permanent crops and the trends there. Mm-hmm. So I think SGMA is actually one mechanism where a lot of these things get worked out at the local level, really what sort of mix of supply and demand management and the implications that those communities work out for their irrigated agriculture is sort of the starting point. But economic development and bond funds and programs and policy changes are things that will always be on the table for addressing the problems that come with that.
Great. I want to change direction a little bit and pull Perry into this conversation. How is SGMA interacting with and dealing with water quality regulations moving forward? We heard some from Perry, but a little more detail on that.
Well, here's the classic scenario. I've got, in the East San Joaquin Coalition, 9 SGMAs being formed, groundwater sustainability authorities. I went to 2 meetings of one, and I asked a question, and this is probably not characteristic of all of them, but I said, well, so what role would you see the coalitions playing? Well, you're going to provide all the groundwater data, right? So I said, well, I was thinking the same thing about you all. No, I think that really these 2 irrigated lands program and SGMAs are going to merge eventually. But what's happening right now is the authorities have to be established. This is the SGMAs are the cities, the irrigation districts, and agriculture. So those 3 have really locally need to figure out, so to speak, who's boss, who's running it, what's the authority, how are we going to structure this? I think in a couple of years, once these start getting settled down, then we're going to all figure out our roles a little better. And that's a generic statement about, similar to what somebody said to me once, if you say what you think a farmer thinks, you're wrong, because there's farmers that will give you every opinion from here to there. Same thing with SGMA. You go to a SGMA organization in the Kings River Basin, it's entirely different from Modesto, different from Redding. So they're not all on the same track. They're all kind of moving at a little bit different speed. They all see their deadlines coming forward. So that's going to influence a lot when they merge together. One thing that was not brought up that I kind of shudder to think of how this is going to work is we have a salt and nitrate management plan, basin plan coming forward that's out of the recycled water policy. That's almost a 3rd track, and there was a little bit of talk about it yesterday, but that's a water quality driven issue for cities and agriculture that needs to fit in with a SGMA approach. So the next 5 years are definitely going to be very interesting in California as we try to sort out all of these issues. But at the end of the day, we've got to be able to continue growing, providing food, and being an economy that's the driver of, I think, the United States in a lot of ways. When you think about where's your garlic and onions and tomatoes come in, almonds and such, pretty much from the Central Valley. So there's an important food source here that we've got to figure out the future of.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
I agree that there needs to be some merging of some of these functions, and it would make a lot of sense to do so, especially in data sharing, figuring out the best way to get accurate data and to share it across agencies for multiple purposes. But I would point out that SGMA was never intended to add a new regulatory structure for groundwater quality. It's about planning, and it's about planning specifically of the impacts of groundwater pumping on water quality. The state has, as Perry well knows, very broad authority to regulate water quality under Port of Cologne and other important laws, and SGMA was not intended to replace that.
And I just want to add, and his mention of recycled water, it is probably one of the biggest resources we have. Wastewater is not wastewater. It's a molecule of water that can be treated. It's not inexpensive, but it's wet. And we have to be much more focused, and I think we've started to take those steps with some of the streamlining that's happening with the State Water Resources Control Board. But we really need to work with other places that utilize their recycled water and treated wastewater even more than we do, to make sure that we understand all of the potential impacts of that. We're poised to use more recycled water in agriculture at the same time that we're implementing the Food Safety Modernization Act, which has some very strict water quality criteria in it. But other countries are doing this. We just need to pull the data together and try to be ahead of the curve with some of the new pharmaceutical issues and antibiotics and hormone issues that are just now being identified, to make sure that this is, in fact, a resource that can be safely used, whether it's for food production, but especially for landscaping uses. We really need to maximize our use of that. It does require an infrastructure investment, but I think it's one that will bring great returns for us if we start with that now.
Well, that opens up a good question, particularly from the University of California's perspective. What do you see as some of the key research needs moving forward? Where do we really need to be targeting some of that research effort, and not just for UC, for a variety of partners? This idea of uptake of what might be in recycled water. I was just down at UC Riverside, and one of their research projects was looking at the endocrine disruptors and how it uptook into citrus trees. Concern. Not sure there's a problem yet, but looking at it. So what other kinds of research, and maybe some of that research isn't just about ag production, similarly helping local communities implement SGMA and the other laws and find those solutions. What kind of research and efforts do you see needed there?
I'll always start. So I think there needs to be research to get into the consumer's head to convince them that recycled water products are safe, if they are in fact safe. If they are, the public perception of use of recycled water, of anything that's close to what they eat or what they are around, I think is a huge hurdle. I think that's the thing you brought up about pharmaceuticals. There's also a huge issue in Kern County right now with reuse of water that's been pumped out of the ground with oil production. It has some infinitesimally small molecules, which you all know in the room, we're at the part per quadrillion now that we can analyze. I mean, does that mean anything? Because the consumers, the activists will say, oh my gosh, you have a quadrillion part of this in the water, and it's in your food too. Does that mean anything? I guess if it does, then the research needs to prove that and get that word out. Same thing, if it doesn't mean anything, we need to understand that, and the consumers need to understand that. I think that the direction of research needs to look at the consumer and their understanding of the products that we make and the dangers that we pose. If they are in fact dangerous, prove that. If not, then we need to look at modern society. We have, what was the population now, 45 million people in the state, 40 million. It's an enormous consumer out there that needs to have, they want more and more information all the time. And I think the technologies of communication out there now, YouTube and such, have passed the networks and others. They've left them in the dust, but they are also very useful in getting this sort of information out. And the University of California has a tremendous competency and trust that I think people can rely on to prove this information or distribute this information.
Well, I think there are tremendous data needs related to Sigma, and in particular around those undesirable results, right? Those impacts that they're supposed to avoid. And to really do that and to come up with plans that work, you need reliable data on things like subsidence and the nexus between groundwater and surface water interaction. So, and you need trustworthy data that people can really believe is true, so that they don't argue about the data and prevent them from actually talking about what to do. Additionally, there's really interesting work going on with conjunctive use projects, flooding agricultural land in winter. A number of projects, including some by UC Davis this last winter. And there's a really interesting, I think, nexus there if those work out and if they aren't showing water quality problems or other issues like that. Potentially, that could be a real good launching point for some policy changes to help enable those kinds of things.
So let me add to the long list for which you have no funding. So a couple things that haven't been mentioned. One is coming back to this issue of drinking water and these very, very small communities that don't have the resources where and you know this as a former rural development director, where we can invest in the capital to upgrade systems that need to be modernized, but it doesn't fund the O&M. And we know that there's cloud technology, there's very large water systems in the state that could offer some of that assistance, but really looking at, if it's not consolidation, what's available that can allow those systems to make sure that every citizen in this state has drinking water. So that would be one to really look at that. I would also say that with the continued advancement of technology and all the regulatory changes, it's a lot of technology, which means it requires a lot of high touch with farmers, because we have farmers of every size, every resource, multiple languages. If ever there was a time to expand cooperative extension, that is the adoption model that still works, folks. And a lot of that's been commercialized. You can partner with commodity groups and with coalition groups, but there's still a need for that framework of people with that kind of expertise of how to work on the field with farmers to do that. I would say that we know, and you brought this up, I'm very interested in the treatment of brackish water, even mobile on-farm brackish water. What could we do to treat on-farm brackish water so that it's useful water? There's still going to be a waste issue, but what kinds of technologies are available that are cost-effective and efficient to help with smaller scale and of course, larger scale desal to make it more efficient, more effective, and minimize the environmental impact of that. Little things, Glenda, just little things.
Well, actually, maybe you or Gordon could take a second and explain a little bit of what the state is trying to do to facilitate innovative technologies. There's at least one or two programs, and I think even some funding, is there not? Well, there's the new water innovative technologies.
Yeah, is that through the CEC?
Not my agency.
Yeah, I think most of that is happening through the California Energy Commission because of the nexus of water and energy, and it has a track record with the standards that they've developed for appliances and other energy efficiencies. That's been a part of that. And then I don't think there's anything at GOPIS, but maybe there is. I'm really sorry. I've been so focused on farm water use efficiency and the SWEEP program, and what DWR is doing to provide grants to the water districts themselves to modernize their systems. But I know that CEC has some great programs, and I think that's where most of that innovation work is happening.
There is. Well, and actually at the national level, the National Science Foundation just recently announced a FUSE, Food, Energy, Water Nexus.
Yeah.
And they're putting some fairly substantial research dollars out there. In fact, we have a large proposal from UC in there to expand a system that I know you and I at least are fairly fond of, the rural-urban connection strategy, which is part of what is being looked at in next week at an ecosystem services workshop, which CDFA has done a great deal of work on how ecosystem services could be part of, is producing on agricultural production and could be even more. So maybe just a moment on what you have been doing with CDFA, ALMI's work on ecosystem services. And elsewhere in the state, there's a lot of interest in looking at that, too, as a different way to incentivize solutions.
Well, there are, in some parts of the country, there are nutrient trading markets that are starting to happen. Utilities are very involved in doing work upstream to have cleaner water coming downstream. So just like water trading needs to make huge advancements, but there again we need data and transparency. I think nutrient trading offers some potential services that could be available, but it comes back to really thinking in a more holistic way, not just parking agriculture in this one industrial thing. When we think about how dependent it is upon nature and the environment to do what we do on the land, then we have to be honest and say we get more than just the crop that gets harvested once a year from that land. And how it's managed can contribute even more positively to the type of environment that Californians in particular value, but it's becoming also an important part of communicating to consumers who are more interested in the whole picture of how was that produced, where was that produced, who's producing it. And so being able to document what we're doing with regard to this whole wheel of ecosystem services is especially important. So water use efficiency, biodiversity, pollinator habitat, all those kinds of things that farmers just do. It's being very intentional and being able to use the data we've collected to communicate that to consumers. We need a broader base of people who understand and support the policies then that will allow farmers to continue to do that.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? So that brings up both for local communities and farmers, all the different players who are trying to implement SGMA. So what do you see as some of their key challenges, and how might we all, research, government, coalitions, et cetera, how might we make it a little easier to deal with those challenges?
Take it away, Cory. Ta-da!
Well, I think if you look at the experience of the adjudicated basins, which is probably our closest analogy, a lot of them evolved. They didn't get it right from the beginning, and they really took a while to hammer out broad consensus around how to govern themselves, what the underlying data is, how to fund projects, what projects needed to be funded, and how to solve their problems. So I personally think that the agencies that are going to most succeed in SGMA are the ones that really do broad outreach and take the time to build consensus and foundational things like putting together a strong governance structure, like making sure that everybody trusts the data and they have quality data, and that they have good conversations about the trade-offs of different solutions. I think that the ones that try to cut corners and just sort of speed forward without really taking the time to build that kind of consensus are asking for trouble.
Okay. I see we have a question in the back there. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm opening it up right there.
There's a hand right there.
Well, no, there's somebody with a microphone.
Okay. Oh.
Oh, you're just handing
Yeah,
out the
it's right
microphone.
over
Sorry,
there.
so here's one right here.
I'm the hander outer.
Yeah, right
Sorry. I thought you were getting ready to ask one.
I could, but I think you got plenty.
Well, thank you for your comments, especially I love the comments about California's role in providing safe and quality food for the country and the world. So, relation to that is, is there an opportunity, especially since California now is going to be fair, we're going to have $15 minimum wage, which I think is great, and it's going to be sustainable by definition in a period of time, to have a carrot, to have incentive for growers to embrace this by having like a fair and sustainable campaign, where we actually, if growers share data and embrace this, then maybe they get some type of certification or part of the team type of thing where we can go out to the world where we are producing both a fair and sustainable product that's safe and high quality, because we don't live in a vacuum. There's Mexico to our south, and there's Arizona and Texas to our east, who aren't, us in New York are the only producing states in the country with $15 minimum wage coming for agriculture, which is great empowerment for people of color and the farm. But, how can we provide an incentive for people to embrace this? Because we are going to do the right thing. Thank you for your time.
So the closest we have, I love that idea, and that's part of communicating and bringing everyone together to communicate that. Here's the blessing and burden of my world. We have 800 organizations who are registered to lobby and be an advocate for agriculture. That's a good thing, but they don't all agree on approaches. Our best platform for that, quite truthfully, is California Grown. From the beginning, I felt that California Grown, when you travel the country and you travel the world, embedded in that is green, is healthy, is nutrition. And so it's can we make that program help communicate that more fully, and can we get more California ag groups and individual farmers and retailers and food service to step in and pay a royalty to help advance that. We're actually seeing more growth and interest from retailers and restaurants than we are from farm groups. Each farm group has its own marketing thing, the way they're going to market. But I believe we can, we can turn what we do as a state, because we value environmental performance and fair wages, whatever it is. We need to turn that around and be a positive as why we should be the preferred source and buy from us. But there hasn't been a lot of agreement in the ag sector for that. I have the California Grown program. We dedicate some specialty crop dollars to that, and I'd love to grow that program. So thanks for the idea. I'm going to get your card. I'll be calling you.
Great. Another question from the audience? Right back there.
Good morning. Dan Monk, UC Cooperative Extension in Fresno County, and I work in an ag education program with growers, and I will tell you that I think there's been tremendous improvements in grower knowledge for irrigation management, more recently nutrient management, and there's been good support for that work, and a real change there. But remember, we only have a very small percentage of our population that's ag educated. And I wonder, going forward, if we're going to be changing policy and doing the good thing, the right thing going forward, don't we need a better understanding of the general public have a better understanding of what agriculture does, the amount of water it uses or requires, the amount of water that consumers really ultimately consume when they're sitting at the table, wearing those cotton jeans, or whatever it is that they're drinking that glass of milk. So I guess my question is how are we going to move forward with sustainable groundwater management, with sustainable water nutrient management, without the public's understanding of what agriculture does? And I guess the larger, maybe the point I could make is without compulsory secondary education. And is that a dream, or is that something that we could actually make happen in our school systems?
Wow.
So there is ag in the classroom, and there is curriculum that actually has been approved. It's gone through the Department of Education. I think there was an effort to mandate ag literacy a number of years ago. I'm not aware of anything in recent times. Again, I'm not trying to shift this to others, but there are 800 organizations that advocate for agriculture. If they got together with other stakeholders who saw the public benefit of this, maybe they should try that again. But you have to bring in all the perspectives. We have some curriculum for environmental education. The school garden programs are really integrating food, ag, science, art, culture into it. So there's a lot of efforts, but there's not one effort. So I don't have an answer for that, because it takes a lot of people to agree that this is the one thing we're going to make our priority this year. Sorry.
Yeah, and I would say the lack of knowledge about agriculture is part of a much larger problem throughout our culture of scientific illiteracy. And that's one reason, one of the new things we're doing at UC Cooperative Extension is actually urging our folks to speak more science to policy, not to go in and say, this is what I think, this is what you ought to do, but to at least go in and say, this is what the science shows, here's the data, and to do it in plain English, which is something Cooperative Extension's much better at than the average scientist, I have to say. But, you know, that's a really big issue, not just for groundwater and ag and this and that and the other. It's really scientific illiteracy in our population in general affecting a lot of policy making. Anybody else want to comment on that or any thoughts?
I just point out this. I mean, this is a continuous problem, and it takes different forms. During the drought, you know, there's been there are frequently these sort of factoids that get tossed out there. Agriculture takes 80% of the water and that kind of thing, that are really challenging to deal with, because obviously the real issues around that are so much more nuanced and important, but it's very difficult to have a nuanced debate during a crisis and when people are trying to use bumper sticker slogans for political purposes. So you know, it's helpful, obviously, for folks like the governor to speak up as he has to defend agriculture, and try to make those points. But I totally agree that it'd be really useful for people to have a better understanding of science and of agriculture and the benefits that it provides.
So unfortunately, we have run to the end of our time. I want to ask all of you to help me in thanking our panel who've done a really great job up there.